Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome to a very special series of episodes of the Human Risk podcast. Normally this show is recorded online, but as we're approaching the 250th episode, I've invited three friends of the podcast to join me in an actual physical studio. But not just any studio, because they've joined me in the world-famous Abbey Road Studios in London, home to countless classic albums, including one by the Beatles that is named after the studio that produced an iconic album cover. Now, since I got my guests to a physical location, I thought I'd make the most of it and record not one, not two, but 3 episodes of the show in an extended session. So over this episode and the next 2, you're going to hear from 3 innovative thinkers who have all been great influences on me and have produced some of the most downloaded episodes of the show thus far. My guests are behavioural science gurus and long-standing friends Rory Sutherland, Gerald Ashley, and Paul Craven. If you've been listening to the show for a while, and if not, where have you been, but better late than never, they'll be familiar names, because Rory, Gerald and Paul have all made solo appearances on the show before. They've also all recorded episodes as duets. So after Rory and Gerald, Gerald and Paul and Rory, there was only one thing left for me to do: bring together the supergroup of Rory, Gerald and Paul. Now, long-term listeners will know that this means you're in for a treat. Not just because you're going to hear some wonderful stories and amazing insights, but also because, in the nicest possible way, the 3 of them can really talk, and they need very little encouragement. So like many artists before them, I'd invited them to Abbey Road Studios, just let them riff on whatever they wanted to talk about. So a lot more guest and a lot less host. Now, since we were in a hit-making studio, I thought it would be a good idea to start with the simple question: what makes a hit? Why do some things go viral and others fail? Unsurprisingly, this was enormous pleasure to record, and you're going to, I think, thoroughly enjoy hearing what Rory, Gerald and Paul have to say. Of course, since we were in the world-famous Abbey Road Studios, we did take some photographs, including recreating that famous album cover on the crossing outside the studios, and you can see some of the results of that in the artwork for this and the following 2 episodes. With all of that said, stand by for what are 3 of my absolute favourite episodes of the show, with 3 of my absolute favourite people on it. These are wonderful episodes. Please enjoy the supergroup of Rory Sutherland, Gerald Ashley and Paul Craven, recorded at Abbey Road Studios, episode 1 of 3. Rory, Gerald and Paul, welcome to the Human Risk podcast at Abbey Road Studios.
It's always a pleasure. I was going to say to be here. I've never been here before, but it's always a pleasure to be a guest on the show. Absolutely fantastic.
Astonishingly, it's my first time, and given my usual performance, probably my last, but we'll see how we get on.
Given how many things I've listened to that have been created or recorded here, I'm delighted and honoured to be here. Thanks for asking.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me. I think it's the first episode with 3 guests, and what 3 wonderful guests to have. You've all been on the show before in various pairs, so I thought it was a good idea to get all of you together in the home of various albums. And I thought that might be an interesting place for us to start, Rory, thinking about why do some things become hits and others don't?
And equally, there's the corresponding question: why do some things become flash-in-the-pan hits or one-hit wonders, and some things really endure? And you have to honestly answer that question by saying, some level, it's beyond prediction.
Yeah.
That there are freakish concatenations and confluences of events that lead things simply to go massive. Sometimes it's a single accidental event. Sometimes it's a series of events. There is an interesting question: is how early can you spot it? And can you tell the difference between those trends which are sticky and those trends which actually burn brightly and then burn out like a firework? And I mean, one thing that is interesting to me, and I think it's just something from marketing I might bring to the party, is that most kind of change is a sort of sigmoid curve. There's an early period of slow, unremarkable growth before things reach some sort of critical mass. Air fryers, for example. I know it's a silly example, but it's actually quite a telling one. Now, what marketers tend to measure, or what businesses tend to measure, is how many air fryers are we selling? Okay, and they tend to look at that pace of growth. Now, in the early days, that's going to be relatively unexciting. A more interesting question is, when people buy an air fryer, how many of them go back to not having an air fryer, and how many of them are kind of complete converts? So, not many people. There are still people without mobile phones. I know very, very few people who got a mobile phone and gave it up. Multi-channel television. Most people didn't want it for years, but once you had it, you couldn't really go back. I think electric cars may be a bit that, for example. But knowing whether they are or whether they aren't is really, really important. But we tend to measure aggregate snapshot data rather than sequential data.
So in the words of someone who used to work here, only time will tell if I'm right or if I'm wrong.
I think what the sort of, dare one say, professional approach to this, of course, is the classic sort of portfolio effect. So you take 20, 30, 100 ideas and you expect 90 to be absolute dogs. 7 or 8 do okay, and you may have 1 or 2 big hits. And I mean, that's a little bit like putting on a musical. You're under a huge risk if you do 1 musical. If you do 10, you're going to do well. But the problem with all of that is that people, and it's why your favourite profession, Rory, the cost accountants come into the scene here, because the problem with those sort of portfolios, if you spend too much at the start,
yes,
and it's number 99's the big one, you run out of money before you get there. And that's a classic problem in Broadway shows, oil exploration, everything. So you do need the accountants whilst you're trying to find something new and exciting. I can't believe I just said that.
I mean, I remember you tweeting once that, everybody always says you need to speculate to accumulate. Yeah. But actually, you need to accumulate to speculate.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Is there a parallel here between something going viral and the frothiest of bubbles in stock markets? And I only throw it to you because obviously we're used to stock markets sort of go up and fall and they have 6 cycles and things. But we've all experienced in our lifetime where they've become absolutely frenzied. It may be in a stock or a sector. And I was I've been reading and actually pushing probably the best book I've read on booms and busts in the last sort of 20 years, by a guy called William Quinn and Aidan Turner. They're 2 academics from Ireland, Northern Ireland. And they were looking at, I think they look at about bubbles over 300 or 400 years. And again, I say this in the context of anything going viral. And what is it that creates that bubble? And they come up with a very interesting idea. They say, well, first of all, the bubble's a useful concept, but actually it's not a very good metaphor. And they prefer the metaphor of fire. And for a fire, you need 3 things. You need fuel, oxygen, and heat. And they go through all these, I'll use the word bubbles again, but I'll try not to use it again. They go through all the big booms in markets, the viral moments, if you like, in stocks or sectors, and see what those 3 components are. And for fuel, they think about it in terms of money, credit, interest rates being low. That's obviously pretty well. Oxygen is perhaps the one which is most linked to sort of the viral nature of anything, which is how marketable is a product and how easily acceptable is it. How can the public access it easily, which I think is very interesting. And finally, and I guess this is where the sort of behavioural science bit comes in, you need speculation. You need amateurs playing the game, people who perhaps wouldn't necessarily ordinarily get into it. And I'm just thinking in terms of the viral concept. And those are really 3 useful concepts. They go through all these, and they go through things like the bicycle boom of the 1890s, which is fascinating.
Absolutely fascinating.
And they really, yeah. Well, read the book. This book is fantastic, called Boom and Bust, which was published a couple of years ago. But why they differentiate themselves, and again, I'm trying to link it back to the whole viral concept, is there's always been an assumption in financial circles that sort of I've hung around with the last 30 years, that bubbles are always bad, okay, and that they always end in disaster. And we can always think of, and indeed some of them have been terrible. Think of the global financial crash of the 2008 and so on and so forth, disastrous. But what these academics do, and they do it in the most playful, interesting, fun book that is easily accessible to anybody, is they say, actually, lots of these things have been really good. They actually ended up creating lots of new innovation. And although many fell by the wayside, we wouldn't have all the technology we have today without that tech boom of the 90s.
A sort of Darwinian process.
Yeah. It's like a sort of forest fire.
Yeah.
This sort of ecosystem renewal.
So the railway boom, of course, it's worth noting that although there was a railway boom and bust, to some extent, there was probably excessive investment in railways in the 19th century.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
However, of course, the real economic beneficiaries were probably landowners rather than railway operators.
Yeah.
So the net economic effect, as a Georgist, sorry, I'm not going to go burbling on because at any conference there's always one Georgist sitting at the back with no. You're the same, okay. One of the extraordinary things about the railways was that it effectively took away the stranglehold of location to some extent because you could conduct business in London while living 50 miles away.
Yeah.
And so. Quite often, and that's probably true of the tech boom in a sense. I mean, the
it's interesting that wider things cluster, which is sort of to do with this. And the old sort of thought experiment, I think it was done by an American economist called Harold Hotelling, who said you've got a big long beach and you've got an ice cream parlour right in the middle, and you decide to open your ice cream parlour. Where do you open? And most people kind of think about it, I want to be right down the end away from that guy. Totally wrong. Because if you sit your ice cream parlour right next to the other one, you will have a much better chance of generated flow of business. And you find this in all sorts of strange clusters. So here's a cluster for you gentlemen to chew on. Italian bathroom tiles all seem to come from about a 20-mile radius. I have no idea why, but they do. But again, it's this hotelling and clustering thing. And so that we stay on emergence, because Christian's already trying to metaphorically press a buzzer here. So that we stay on emergence, maybe this is to do with power laws, and it may be to do with complex systems. And as you said, Rory, some things are just inherently unpredictable.
Yeah.
And I suppose to your point, Paul, about bubbles, which we're not calling them bubbles, we never know when they're going to burst. What is the last bit that makes it happen? But I think people are uncomfortable with emergence because it seems to emerge and it's not predictable.
The bicycle boom of the 1890s is fascinating, actually, because it really was a viral frenzy in terms of people. And look at the adverts in the newspapers.
Prompted by the invention of the Rover safety bike. Is that because the Rover safety bike was an extraordinary thing in that whereas most progress is kind of evolutionary, Rover, which is the precursor of the car company, came up with a design of a bicycle almost out of nowhere that is pretty much identical to the design of bicycles now.
It hasn't changed.
And it hasn't really changed.
They nailed it,
pretty much nailed it in one, freakishly.
But the amazing thing that came out of that boom was that, for example, it basically made Dunlop, the world leader in rubber.
It also actually made for tarmacked roads because there weren't many cars at the time, if any. Okay, and the real pressure to tarmac roads obviously didn't come from horse owners who weren't particularly bothered, right?
Who couldn't give
exactly.
This is interesting in itself.
It came from the bicycle lobby, which demanded smoother roads.
Yeah, but it's interesting in itself because also tarmacadam became available, or the tar as the lower distillate of oil became available because you had the big oil boom in the States in the 1860s, and suddenly there's a load of this kind of stuff all over the place. And that's the other thing that happens here with this idea of emergence and maybe looking at overall systems, is there are lots of factors that seem to come together, maybe by chance, some may trigger another. You'd be hard-pressed to make a gigantic Venn diagram to explain any of these sort of things, but it's a curiosity, and I suppose it's the element of chance, in a way, kind of what makes everything so interesting.
Rory, you talk a lot about Red Bull as being, with hindsight, seems to make sense, but logically, you could imagine yourself being in a sort of committee.
I think this is a point which I made in passing years ago, and I kind of forgot about it, and then I realised it was more important than I realised, which is there are more good ideas you can post-rationalise than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalise.
Yeah.
Now, all businesses tend to be in the business of demanding good reasons for everything you do. It's impossible to invest if you can't make the case.
Our friends, the cost accountants again.
The cost accountants. Whereas actually, there are quite a lot of things which nobody asks for in market research, which doesn't really make much sense, whether it's the Dyson vacuum cleaner, whether it's an espresso machine, okay. I could have easily killed all those ideas. If I'd been a cost accountant in the room with some power, I could have said, there's no evidence that people will pay 70 pence for a cup of coffee they make themselves at home. There's no evidence there's a market for the £900 vacuum cleaner, okay, let alone the £400 hairdryer, okay.
Grief.
Okay, and there's absolutely no evidence that people will pay £1.50 for a nasty tasting drink in a small can. Okay, none of those things make sense in advance. All you can do is effectively, through a Darwinian process, see what succeeds and then explain it afterward. Now, what that means is the requirement that things make sense in advance is a major constraint on useful innovation, in fact.
Yeah.
Okay. And what tends to happen about these things that suddenly explode is that somebody stumbles onto something that you can post-rationalize, but you can't pre-rationalize, typically an entrepreneur or a weirdo, or whatever, okay? And that thing suddenly taps an extraordinary amount of unspoken, unthought demand. The Uber map is my absolute go-to example here, which is everybody thought they wanted taxis to turn up sooner. What nobody seemed to realise was that what they hated about waiting for a taxi was the degree of uncertainty.
Yeah, didn't know where the hell it was.
And so when Uber had this kind of weird kind of epiphany, watching a James Bond film on the example of car tracking in a Bond film, and somebody said that's what should happen when you order a cab, okay? There's some dispute about whether it's a recent Bond film or whether it's actually Goldfinger.
It's Goldfinger.
I think it's Goldfinger.
It was Goldfinger.
Yeah, absolutely, because they track Goldfinger's a car, which is made of gold, of course, isn't it? That's the whole thing. He's smuggling gold because the car's made of gold.
Must have had a hell of an engine.
Exactly. But suddenly people then have this, the consumer, the user has this epiphany, which is, I never knew I wanted this, but I really do.
Yeah.
And, this is why I'm fascinated by weird categories of product like mattress toppers or air fryers, which basically fulfill to an extraordinary degree a desire that nobody realised they had.
But talking of ideas that don't make sense, and then after they've happened, and then they get this kind of almost like a viral following, we're in the perfect place, because you think about it.
Yep.
When they recorded the album in '69, they were going to call the album Everest, and to be fair, some bean counter said we can't really fly you four out to Nepal. And one of them said, well, I'll tell you what, let's go out on the zebra crossing and walk across that. And they created, probably the most iconic album cover of all time. And if not that, they certainly created hundreds of thousands of tourists every year walking across the zebra crossing. Now, that idea wouldn't have made sense beforehand. Let's just walk across the road.
No, completely. No,
and then he took, six photos that day, I think, actually came out of it. And think of the iconic nature of that crazy idea that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of beforehand, unless it was a whimsical thing to do.
Well, what strikes me, which is thinking about Red Bull, I don't know why, but why is it that some things fall out of fashion? So I think it's true to say that, Rory, you and I have manfully promoted the idea of sherry, but it's never come back.
No.
I know it's a minority sport, and we both realised that it was our parents' generation who invited vague friends round for a sherry, and that's just completely gone. But some things may be fashionable, and if a fashion changes, they just die and don't come back.
It may be with sherry that the consumption occasion disappeared.
Yes.
There are certain things that are limited. I mean, Pimm's has struggled to make itself into a winter drink, and will probably always fail. Sometimes it's locational.
Guinness has become quite a good summer drink.
That's interesting.
The cold version.
That's very interesting. Yeah,
I'm a Guinness fan.
Case.
What, sherry?
No, Guinness. Oh, Guinness and sherry together.
Together.
Is there any other way?
But just as my joke is, which I think is true, is that Pernod tastes delicious in France and disgusting anywhere else. There are certain things where the enjoyment of the thing is contextual, and if the context disappears.
Right.
So the time when sherry was big, people would have drunk water with a meal, probably in Britain.
Yes.
One of the reasons why those fortified wines were so big is that other than very posh rich people, people didn't really drink wine with food. So if you invited anybody round, what you did instead was you knocked back a few sherries. Or...
Now, the irony is here, in these, so when all the youngsters are, by the way, I'm not condoning drinking or excessive drinking in any way. That's the usual disclaimer from me at this spot. But I gather that doing something called shots is very fashionable amongst the young before they go out.
Yeah.
Before they go, I'm told. And I'm also told by other people that shots are actually too strong to get into the bloodstream quickly.
Yeah.
Whereas the optimal alcohol to get into your bloodstream quickly, were that to be your nefarious intention of drinking alcohol, is sherry. Because it's lower alcohol when it gets absorbed with the stomach lining quicker.
So it's a stealth bomber of the alcoholic drinks world.
Correct.
It gets in under the radar.
Whereas your spirits, the stomach puts up barriers initially because it realises it's got something nasty and poisonous in it.
Got it. Interestingly, all those drinks like Mad Dog 2020, are actually around that strength, aren't they? They're around fortified wine.
I wouldn't know, Rory.
Apparently, yeah.
Allegedly,
but the drinks
my
that
lord.
you drink out of a brown paper bag,
Anyhow,
tend
look,
also to be around that strength.
Look, we're missing a marketing opportunity here. I've
Bucky,
got it
that's
now.
another one.
It's Sherry and Ozzy Osbourne, isn't it? I mean, there's the obvious one. Live like Ozzy, have a bottle of sherry, or 2 or 3.
Was he partial to a tipple?
Can be. For
Maybe.
a price, I'm
Maybe
sure.
available.
And the old bat?
But it is interesting. It's, obviously, some things are superseded through technology, but then some things just sort of die for, I would say, almost no particular reason.
I mean, sometimes there is a very oblique reason. So, for example, consumption of port and after-dinner drinks has probably been adversely affected by a decline in smoking, for example. So you get some very, very oblique effects because, whereas before, if there was a sort of critical mass of smokers at a dinner table, basically people hung around for 40 minutes after the meal had been finished, stubbing fags in the saucer of the coffee cup, as I remember, right? That occasion just disappeared because now people put everything in the dishwasher and you expect...
Drinks are very much a fashion thing. And then something that is popular but is not well marketed and almost goes out of its way not to be properly marketed, I always think is classical music. Now, I'm not a big classical music buff, but I turn on the radio and I hear something and I like it. And of course, I don't know what the hell it is or who it's by. And then when you eventually find out it's by some obscure sort of rival to Mozart, and it's his 14th Concerto Opus 6, da-di-da-di-da. Instead, it needs a sort of bat out of hell type label. So don't you feel that classical music is wrongly categorizing itself for sales? Why don't we have like Mozart singles or something?
Classic FM, the radio station, was started almost on a bet, where somebody said, okay, there's a very strict rule, okay, which is it can't be longer than 7 minutes.
Right.
Just in case someone doesn't like a particular piece.
Because
I know someone who, a very, very good organist, who owes part of his retirement fund to the fact that he managed to record Widor's organ symphony in under 7 minutes, which is the version that Classic FM always plays. So he feels slightly guilty about it. That's why I'm not naming him. But,
listen, I'm not a classical music buff, but have you ever heard the Beethoven's metronome theory?
No.
And well, first of all, it's a good name for an album, isn't it? Beethoven's metronome. Well,
there's for a band, actually. Yeah.
I don't think this is a conspiracy theory, but I'm sure there'll be lots of Radio 3 listeners.
Here we go.
But apparently, someone well versed in it said that when Beethoven was writing down his scores, obviously he was deaf, he was reading from the wrong part of his metronome.
Oh.
So that when people came to play it later on, they were playing it faster than he meant it to be, which made it better. Now, I love a...
Right, well, we're down a byway. I don't think I can reverse out of this particular cul-de-sac, but it just struck me that classical music could do a lot better if it was better labelled and branded.
It probably suffers. There is a thing called, I think, Adagio, which is sort of Spotify for classical music. Classical music particularly suffers because streaming services and search do it a particular disservice.
Right.
Because obviously a track is a movement, for example. And so what you really need is a specialized classical streaming service, which you then have to pay for separately.
Yeah.
And that's probably been to the whereas in a good old-fashioned record shop, someone might go in to buy the White Album and have a shufty around and, buy a little bit of J.C. Bach here and there. That kind of serendipity doesn't really work to the favour of classical music online.
Well, of course, that's the argument against all these search engines, is the death of serendipity.
Yeah, and also the fact that you only get what you know you want, not what you didn't know you want. So I have a major... I mean, this would also apply to dating services, dating apps, I think. But in the property world, if you talk to an estate agent, one of the things they say is that everybody comes into a human estate agent, with a list of criteria, and they end up buying something which meets none of those criteria because they fall in love with a place with a view of the river or roses round the door or whatever it may be, or a large greenhouse or whatever, which they weren't thinking about when they made their list of criteria. And the danger of using, let's say, Zoopla or Rightmove is that we only end up looking at those things which we think we want. Now, a good estate agent is actually asking a second question, which is the question of sales, which is, what could I sell this guy that I couldn't sell to anybody else?
Yeah.
Because he wants to offload stuff off his book. Now, if I turn up, okay, an estate agent will probably go, this guy's a bit of a weirdo. I can finally get rid of that fucking windmill. Right? And he'll show me the windmill. And even though I've demanded a 3-bedroom garden in Leytonstone, right, I'll end up living in a bloody windmill.
Perfect.
Okay?
Perfect.
That's a much more efficient market, actually, than a one-way market where people say what they want. And
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the biggest problems is no one's asked this question, whether property websites have contributed to rising property prices. Because previously you might see a house you liked, okay, in an estate agent's window and go, shit, that's a lot less expensive than I thought. You may occasionally... Now, what happens with a property website is you search around the maximum you can possibly afford.
Sure.
And actually, if something comes in too cheap, you're actually less likely to buy it.
Right.
Because you think, I'm not actually extending myself. I'm not leveraging myself to the maximum extent.
I'm waiting for Rightmove now to start changing all their the sort of bits you fill in the box ticking where it says what you don't want, and I can imagine Rory going, no windmill.
But I tell you what, this ties in to something which is familiar to everybody around this table, of course, which is effectuation. And effectuation is, and this really applies to single males under the age of 30, 40, 50, even whatever. And this is when you get home and there's nothing to eat. And it's too late to get anybody in. But you open the fridge and you find what's in the fridge and you kind of make something.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of offhand way of doing things. Whereas the correct way is you've got the Master Chef professional cookbook. You spent God knows how many hours chopping wildly expensive vegetables.
And you order in all the ingredients necessary.
Which has all been jetted in from Peru and all the rest of it. And then you strictly apply the recipe and cook it. And the interesting thing is innovation is more about raiding the fridge than buying the cookbook. And I think it's an important thing. Again, it's this idea that maybe this is emergence. You go home to your fridge and you've got the most bizarre things left over.
The two fantastic things that arose exactly from effectuation in restaurants, which is nachos.
Right.
Okay, which was a load of American tourists who were starving, and all the guy had was some corn chips and cheese and a bit of salsa. There actually is a guy called Nacho who died. I'm not making this up. What's it short for in Spanish? Is it not Fernando? It's something short for something.
Absolutely. I was going to say he's called Trevor now.
No. There's actually a guy, his Christian name was Nacho, who's known. He's actually known. He operated some restaurant in Juarez or somewhere just across the US border, I think. And he served these American tourists with what was entirely a contrived, cobbled-together dish. And I think that's also true of the omelette Arnold Bennett, which was Arnold Bennett staying at the Savoy.
Ah, right. Yeah.
And they had some haddock left over. They had a load of cheese and eggs.
This effortlessly segues into the Balti, of course, which is Hindi for a bucket. So the next time you go and order a Balti, you're just ordering a bucket of curry.
But to link this in with what you were saying earlier about fashions, it's phenomenal. Think about it. Lobster, right? In the 19th century, this was considered to be,
Junk food.
Real.
Yeah.
They threw it in the, it was used in prisoners. It was, thrown off in the streets. It was, and how fashions change. Now it's the most expensive thing you can buy.
Where I come from, and also in the north of Scotland, where I also come from, in Wales, effectively near the Wye, and also in areas in Scotland. If you got a job as a domestic servant in a large country house in the 19th century, one of your stipulations would be you not be expected to eat salmon more than 3 times a week.
Yes.
Because otherwise, in order to cheaply feed the servants, you just give them salmon every sodding day.
I've got a similar rule for myself at home.
Yes, and then lobster only 3 times a week.
Mr. Ashley is not to have lobster more than I thought the other element of all of this, which is kind of, we know all this, but it's worth talking about, is fat tails and the fat tail and the distribution. And isn't the smart way to innovate or smart way to make money is to somehow farm the fat tail? If you can find something that is perceived to be unusual, but you could make a lot out of it, you can make a lot of it. We tend to think of thin tails with just a tiny amount of things right down the end of Southend Pier, sort of metaphorically speaking. But occasionally you do get clusters that are away from a norm. And it seems to me that clusters that are away from a norm is where the real money is.
But isn't that your raiding the fridge idea?
Yeah, similar.
I think there's another way where you do it, where you create a new norm. So I was reading the book by Russ Roberts, which is a very good book on kind of complexity, decision-making and rationality. He's the podcast of Econ Talk, and a really good guy. And he makes the point that it's impossible to be rational about the future because it hasn't happened yet, and all the data you have to make a decision comes from the past.
Yeah.
Okay? And he makes a fantastic example, which is far better, I think, than my example of air fryers. In other words, you didn't want an air fryer, but you get one, and you suddenly discover that effectively having an air fryer changes your preferences, because suddenly you attach importance to something that it never occurred to you to attach, because it wasn't available. Okay?
Right.
And Russ makes the obvious point of having children as a completely stupid decision if looked at. So if you ask anybody, any couple, childless couple, I'll use Paul Dolan's designation, a child-free couple, okay, at the age of about 32, what do you really enjoy doing? Having a high disposable income, taking exotic holidays, staying out late, socialising, okay? Having a 2-seater sports car, okay? Now, for all the things they care about, the act of having children is absolutely stupid, okay? Utterly, it basically destroys everything they enjoy in life when they have children. But as Russ points out, that the act of having children changes your preferences and your kind of utility function. So that, now this isn't quite true, okay? So that picking up your daughter from a party at 2:00 in the morning, okay, is almost as enjoyable as going to Studio 54. Okay, it isn't as enjoyable. I'm going to be really honest with you now.
I think
don't
that's
think
a
it is
stretch.
as enjoyable.
I think that's a stretch.
But nonetheless, it changes your instinct so much. Your protective instinct.
But don't you
so
post-event rationalise, because now you kind of
Yeah.
got the kids, so you've just got to recalibrate everything.
Everybody who leaves London and moves to the country will do something like buying camping equipment or a canoe. You see, because these are things which were of not much use in London, but are more useful if you live in the countryside. And therefore, they almost.
I thought they would throw it away because they used it. They bought it in London, thinking we're always going to go out to the countryside. They never used it. When you get to the countryside, you think, I don't need this bloody stuff. Let's chuck it out.
I've got this image of thousands of abandoned canoes.
It's like,
and we haven't had a drink yet. No sherry.
I mean, there probably is a heavy degree of post-rationalisation that goes on.
Yeah,
There's effectively, you reverse engineer your preferences to suit your circumstances, which is, of course, irrational, except that if we didn't do it, we go mad.
The fox and the grapes.
Yeah, fox and the grapes.
East's fox and the grapes. I never wanted them anyway when the fox couldn't get them.
Which John Elster talks about, which is there's sour grapes and there's what's called sweet lemons, which is, my experience of spending 3 years in a Turkish prison. was really formative. I wouldn't be the person I was, where you actually take a bad experience and rewrite it. By the way...
That's a history of public schools.
Yes, absolutely.
I loved it.
But by the way, that Fox and the Grapes phenomenon, I think, can be exploited quite a bit, because if you take NIMBYism, and I was talking to a bunch of people, perhaps a few Georgists, you never know, about this, which is part of the reason why NIMBYism is such a problem, is that if your next door neighbour says, I want to build a loft extension or a conservatory, okay, they add 100,000 to the value of their house, and you get 0.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if you just got, look, tell you what, the loft extension will be a bit of a nuisance, so I'll repaint your back window frames. You can, fine, right, okay. Now, what's interesting is I think we can take a sort of quid pro quo as long as there is a quo. Now, the quo doesn't have to be the same size as the quid. Now, the classic example of this, which doesn't apply in London, where everybody's a bastard, but where you live, for example, in East Kent, okay, if you pull over to let someone come through in traffic because they're parked cars on either side of the road, and the person you've let through doesn't give a little wave of acknowledgement, that's on a par with paedophilia in East Kent. That's just that's Rolf Harris stuff, right? Okay, not so much in London, where there's a far greater degree of anonymity. But I had a conversation with.
I think if you thank
there's a
London,
there's a social cost.
There's a social. Just the acknowledgement that you did me a favour is almost enough.
Yes.
And I've kept asking about this, saying, one of the problems with building anything or doing anything is if you actually said, we're going to build a nuclear power station, I mean a small one, right, outside your town, but you're going to get half price electricity for 10 years, I think most people will go roll it on.
Yeah.
But instead you have no one likes acquiescing to a deal where someone else gets something and you get precisely zip.
That's the famous psychological experiment, isn't it? If I'm given £10 and I offer you a certain amount and you're the one that decides whether that happens or not.
So there's a way of looking at property and planning permission through the lens of the ultimatum game.
Yeah, the ultimatum game,
Yeah. Which is, I'm going to build an extension and you can swivel. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I think the thing about all of this is that people have got their own view of value as well. So some people are not prone to fashion. And if we had a camera in here now, it would be
the reason this is audio only.
You can see why we're audio.
Speak for yourself, Gerald.
But it is again, folding it back slightly, it is interesting that people will put up with almost anything except perceived unfairness.
So let's just talk about the ultimatum game then. Because Rory, you might want to explain this for the benefit of our listeners. The ultimatum game. The idea being that you have, say, £10, you have two people in the room, and one person has the £10.
Yes.
And he or she then has to offer some or all or none of it to the other person.
Party.
And the other person decides whether to accept or not. And if they don't accept, no one gets anything.
Yeah.
Now, if we were all as amazingly rational and logical, you would accept anything you're given as the second person because you came in with nothing and you're walking away with, say, a pound out of 10 or even a penny out of 10. But there's this sense of fairness. If you've suddenly got £10 and you offer me, and I think the numbers are sort of 20 or 30% of the amount.
Yeah, it varies a bit by culture, apparently.
Okay.
It'll be a Fibonacci number. It'll be 38.2%.
But there is this very strong sense of fairness. I don't mind you gaining, but I want something out of it. You've been lucky enough to have a windfall of £10. You're not having any of that unless you give me some of it. I don't expect necessarily 50-50. Some do, maybe. But 20 will keep me quiet and let you keep the 80.
Yeah.
Or sorry, the 280.
But naught is really, really...
But no, I'm going to take you down with me.
This immediately conjures up the Great Train Robbery. Because the interesting thing about the Great Train Robbery, having watched a documentary about it recently, is essentially two firms came together to make it happen. And they didn't trust one another, but they couldn't really do the deal with one another. And so they very reluctantly agreed to split it down the middle. But it nearly didn't happen because this idea, look, the original guy and the guys under Bruce Reynolds, we put this whole plan together, but then they didn't have a right expertise or number of people and all the rest of it. And these other guys came and said, yeah, we'll help out, but it's 50-50. And the deal nearly didn't happen. So that's an example of that. And of course, one can never go by any of these interviews without talking about Ronnie Biggs. And the interesting thing about Ronnie Biggs was he had virtually nothing to do with the robbery. He was given a job as a mate, and his job was to find a driver who could drive a train. And he selected a guy who couldn't drive a train that they stopped. And he's the one who became famous. So look at that as an emergence out of all the great brains of people. And there were some quite serious brains in the Great Train Robbery. It's Ronnie Biggs, who was one of life's spear carriers, who ended up living in Brazil with an exotic dancer, my lord. And, and all that flowed from it.
I always have a bit of a problem. This may be because I come from Kent, which is where most of these things are conceived. Okay. But when I first moved to Kent, my neighbour was one of the Brinksmat gang. He ended up shot in the head in a Lewisham car park. But I didn't notice anything unusual about him, except for the fact that when you walked towards his house, it lit up like a Christmas tree with security lights. But I always think that the absolutely non-violent heist, from a purely utilitarian point of view, if you allowed the public to sentence those people, they'd give them about 2 months in jail, wouldn't they?
Well,
because in the case of, for example, the Lloyds Bank heist or any of those sort of safety deposit boxes, the money in the safety deposit boxes is probably every bit as dodgy as the people who are nicking.
Yeah,
okay?
absolutely.
And secondly, those heists add to general merriment, don't they?
Well, it's almost impossible not to admire the old codgers who did the Hatton Garden raid.
And you make a massive movie about it 5 years later.
Well, they made three. They made three. And I have to say to any listeners, none of them are that good, to be honest. Thinking of heists are interesting for a number of reasons. Because, again, and this never really comes out in adventure films and films in general, and because it's too boring. Essentially, they're sort of hyper-active versions of project management. Because, somebody has actually done all the boring project management stuff. And, when James Bond walks out of the hotel and the car's there, well, somebody must have planned it. There must be an accounts department who dealt with all
Actually,
that.
there's also a really interesting thing in crime, which is what you might call the long tail thing, which is the thing that does you is actually something absolutely left field and unanticipated. So there's an extraordinary case where Piers Brosnan is actually doing a whole series on Sky Crime at the moment, on the Great Heist. And one of them is the Antwerp diamond heist, which was planned by these sort of philosophical criminals called the School of Turin, who are Italian criminals. And the thing was utterly, utterly brilliant in its conception. And the thing that screwed them was they went back to a safe house, basically with the contents of sort of a third of these safety deposit boxes full of diamonds, okay? And they cleared up, and on the way back to Turin in the car, they took the rubbish that they'd cleared up from the flat, which they'd entirely wiped clean, and they just chucked it on some verge somewhere. And they intended to set fire to it, but they got disturbed, so they didn't set fire to it. It's just a bag of rubbish by the road. And actually, Italians probably notice that less than Belgians do, if we're being... It so happened, okay, that the land on which they dropped this rubbish belonged to Belgium's most anally retentive man, okay, right? I'm not making this up, who took it into the police station unopened and said, it's a disgrace, people have been dropping rubbish on my land. And the police would go, oh, for fuck's sake, not this guy again. All he ever does is come in and complain about silly, trivial information. And they pull open this rubbish bag.
And there's the evidence.
It's a basically, getaway car, vault, okay? Okay? Well, suddenly the cops are going, hold on a second. He might have actually snuffed on something here. And there was DNA from a half-eaten sandwich in the bag, which then led to the whole thing being caught. But that's, I think, what's so fascinating is that it's tiny, tiny, ludicrous details, which are quite often what actually,
of course, what
kibosh the whole thing.
Yeah, and of course, the obvious survivorship bias. We never hear of the great crimes. We've all done loads, I'm sure, between us. But you're right about that. But I'm just kind of struck by the sort of sexiness of films about heists and things. In actual practice, of planning all these things, it must be rather deadly boring.
Yeah, there must be a lot of grunt work.
Yeah, there's a lot of working out of stopwatches, how long the car's outside the van and all this sort of stuff. I wouldn't have the patience to do it. I'm not a natural person for a heist.
Actually, my criminal career has been cut short by DNA profile. And that's not because of the likelihood of getting caught. It's because I really hate cleaning. And the extent to which you'd have to wipe down a place after committing a crime is just too tedious, isn't it?
Yeah, it's bothered.
All that bloody bleach, for God's sake.
So I'm going to pause the conversation with Rory, Gerald and Paul there, and we'll pick it up in the next episode. In that, they're going to talk about super spreaders in the positive sense of spreading ideas and trends, cognitive diversity, innovation, and a whole lot more. While you wait for that episode to be released, do have a look in the show notes. There are links to the previous appearances that Rory, Gerald, and Paul have made there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star rating and review for it, please do so on whichever platform you're using. It really does help. I'll be back with another episode featuring these 3 fabulous guests very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe and thank you so much for listening.